Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dr. Doctor, the show where no topic is too hot or too cold. Whether it's politics, religion, relationships, entertainment, or everyday life, you will be hearing from the experts. This show is not for the faint of heart or the faint of mind. But if you want to be inspired, you have come to the right place. And now, prepare to be enlightened as we introduce the host of Dr. Doctor, Dr. Peter Tassi, and his close advisor, Dr. Fooch.
Welcome back to Dr. Doctor, and it's great to have Junior with us again today. And if you've been following, today starts our series of the great minds in history. We did the introduction to the great minds of history, and we hope you had the opportunity to hear the introduction. And today we're going to do one of many we consider the great minds of history. And today we're covering Leonardo da Vinci. I think that for many people, ourselves included, of all the great minds in history, and there's so many of them, Leonardo da Vinci is considered the greatest mind in history. I don't know. Would you agree with that, Junior?
I think most people would, yeah. I would say so.
Yeah, he's the greatest mind in history. It's an amazing story Leonardo has. I mean, here's a guy, he was born illegitimate. Mm-hmm. His father did raise him, and his father was somewhat prominent in their village. So he had money and some power. But the woman he had Leonardo with, she was a peasant girl, so he couldn't marry her. So he went on to marry 4 times, had 10 or 12 kids. But Leonardo was raised basically without his mother. And unfortunately, she had to keep her distance from him and watch them grow up from a distance. And Leonardo, as a result of that, even though some of his stepmothers were mean to him and one was good to him, they say that he grew up a very lonely little boy, because he didn't have his mother, and his father was too busy as a businessman to spend time with him. So he grew up very lonely and alone. He did have an uncle, Francesco, who he was like a father figure to him. Francesco was a man who wouldn't work. He was a real character and a comic, and but he couldn't hold a job. But he was a great mentor to Leonardo, and taught Leonardo to contemplate life and ask questions. And this is one of the things I think, that because Leonardo grew up without a mother, and for all intents and purposes father never around, Leonardo would spend a lot of his days, even as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, just in nature, contemplating nature. And even as a little boy, he was amazed at how different plants would solve different problems. Like one would help you sleep, or this herb would do this herb. So even as a child, he has an insatiable curiosity. He would never stop asking questions, probably to the point where he was obnoxious to others. Just curious about everything in life and asking questions about everything, and kind of escaping into his own world of curiosity and wondering about the wonder of nature. We know that Leonardo, why he's considered the greatest mind in history, is because he was brilliant in many areas. A lot of the brilliant minds we will look at, they were brilliant in one area, or 2 or 3. Leonardo's different. Leonardo's brilliant in every area. The damn shame is that a lot of his works were sold off after he died, lost, all his lifetime works lost. But enough remains on Leonardo that he is recognized for the great mind he was. He was a painter, and of course we know the greatest paintings ever done, like the Last Supper, the Mona Lisa, done by Leonardo. He was a sculptor, a botanist, a musician, an inventor, a physicist, an architect, an anatomy. Okay, he was a writer. He was a master mechanic, and some say he was a brilliant philosopher. Although he never wrote philosophy, they knew it by the things that he would say to people. Like, they were very philosophical approach to life and rather brilliant. So this guy, there was no end to what he could do and what he was interested and what he would do. What stands out for you, Junior, when you think of Leonardo?
Well, just like you say, the diversity. Usually people are gifted in one area, and I mean, it was just across the board. It was literally everything.
Everything.
Of course,
yes.
artistic. Most people recognize him
Yes.
as a great artistic genius.
Yes.
But the scientific element, it just phenomenal. You mentioned all the different areas. Mathematics was another one. Brilliant in mathematics. Civil engineering, like architectural stuff. The human body, the anatomy. He actually worked on cadavers to try to understand how the body works.
Right.
It just a botany, plant. It's just like you say. There's absolutely no limit.
No
It
limit.
just seemed like he could tackle anything.
Yes.
He just had that type of intellect
Yes.
that it didn't matter what it was. He could basically understand it. And you have to remember, he had no real mentors.
No.
He predated science. He was like,
Right.
before him, I mean, really, what was there? You know what I mean? What really, these later fellas, Einstein and all these other ones, I mean, at least they had, people behind them that they could research and look. Whereas his was just out of the blue.
Yeah.
It was just like,
Yeah.
You know.
One of the amazing things he said was, before, like you say, before even science, he said that everything must be based on fact and math. You can't just speculate something and say this is the way it works. It had to make sense to him. And that's why he was an insatiable researcher, never stopped.
no, I mean, and even if you, I mean, to consider for somebody to be that great of an artist and then have that, aptitude for science and math and stuff like that, you just never see that. I've never.
No.
He was like basically what in maybe 20 billion. I mean, there's nothing to compare him to.
Right.
He's so off the scale with everything.
Yes.
It's just hard to imagine that somebody could be that prolific.
Prolific,
Every
that's the word.
field,
yes.
whatever he chose, whatever, and designing bridges that MIT just last year said were would work. That, I mean, people back then no idea about anything, and just out of the blue, here comes a guy, and comes up with all these machines that could fly, and I mean, it's basically mind-boggling. I don't think there's ever been a mind that you could compare to in terms of, like I say, the versatility.
Right.
There might be, of course, there's people that are more prolific in mathematics and engineering and that, but when you put it all together with everything,
Yes.
it's not even close.
No.
There's
No.
nobody that, you know what I mean? His IQ must have been well over 200.
Yes.
I mean, there's no way to really measure it because it was before IQ tests and all that, but I'm sure he was scoring well over 200. And it's just we've never seen this before. There's there's brilliant minds. Edison, a brilliant inventor. Einstein, brilliant in theoretical physics. But that's basically, I mean, that's their field.
Right.
But you get this guy here. I mean, there was no limit.
No
he
limit
could
to it.
seem to understand everything.
Yes. It's absolutely astounding. And even as a painter, I mean, he's known for being this brilliant, one of the great painters in history. But his painting is great not only because he introduced new techniques in his painting, like he introduced third and fourth dimensions to his painting that the world had never seen, but the work itself is so brilliant, it's indescribable. And he did very few paintings actually in his life, which I want to talk about in a minute, but the ones that he did do and completed, they're so brilliantly done. And whether it's the baptism or the Annunciation or the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, and sculpturing too, brilliant sculpture. In fact, him and Michelangelo once, as Leonardo aged, Michelangelo came on the scene and they argued over that big piece of marble, who would get it. And Michelangelo ended up getting it and doing David with it, which, one of the great sculptures in all of history. But no, the guy was so brilliant. I mean, look at some of his inventions now. You mentioned flying machines, which he studied birds for years and how they'd fly. He knew that humans would eventually be able to fly. He just didn't, in the 1400s, we're talking so primitive, he didn't have motors to work with. He didn't have any kind of foundation. Most brilliant minds have some foundation, they build on it. This guy, like you say, it's out of nowhere. And he creates these things. Flying machines. He designed a submarine that would go underwater. Skin diving outfits, where he thought about in warfare, where you can go under the water, stay under there for a long time. And he actually designed skin diving outfits that looked similar to what we saw in the First and Second World War. And you could blow ships up and not be detected. He designed armored carts, similar to tanks, bombs with fins, exploding bombs. Back then they release out of a cannon a ball. His would actually explode like they do today. Machine guns, tanks, fortifications. I mean, this guy, just in the military aspect, and the only reason he did it, he was a man that wanted peace. He didn't believe in war, but he would be commissioned to do these things, and he would do them to survive, to make money, to eat, and but at the same time, he didn't believe in any form of violence. He was a man of peace. And so a lot of what he did design, he viewed it as defensive. Like when it came to the forts and things like that to protect them. A lot of his designs were, and there's too many for us to mention, but they were forms of defense against attackers. It's unbelievable. That's just one area, just the military, whenever he was commissioned to do work. It's really unbelievable. And then we have all his other inventions and works and so on and so forth. He's an inspiration to people because Da Vinci, I don't know, today, if you had this young kid that was always wandering around and lost in his thought and asking thousands of questions and jumping from one thing to another, what do we call him today? Attention deficit? ADHD?
Yeah.
Huh?
They probably would.
Yeah.
You mentioning about the military too. You have to remember back in those days, there were so many different conquests. Everything was so, like you say, he probably did it out of a defensive view.
Yes.
There were so many invasions. So
it was constant invasion.
You were constantly at risk.
Yes.
You were constantly at risk. But it's just amazing the versatility. It's mind-boggling.
Yes, and now You know, this is I think when I read about Da Vinci and look at his life, I often think of young kids today and people today. I mean, how many people today are considered kind of weird and or crazy or have attention deficit, and really underneath that, they're pretty brilliant. There could be geniuses that are buried there.
Well, that's autism, right? Where they're geniuses, and some people, for instance, some are musical geniuses, some are artistic, some are mathematical. But it almost reminds me of an autistic kid. But they're very centralized. They can only really do one thing brilliantly, like maybe work with numbers.
Right.
It seemed like Da Vinci was autistic with everything.
Right.
This is the difference between. This is what separates him between him and everybody else.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, even Sir Isaac Newton, considered the greatest mathematician and scientist of all time, he didn't paint.
Right.
He wasn't an artistic genius.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm sure Da Vinci could probably learn like 10 languages in a couple of months with that type of intellect. It's just.
Yes.
There was no limit.
No limit, no. He even got commissioned by kings to put on pageants. So they'd have a big festival, a big thing. The queen is getting married, the girl's getting married, she's going to be a queen or whatever. They got to have a major festivity. No different than today, only back then it was even more elaborate. And he would come in, and he was so brilliant at organizing a pageant and putting on a stage show with all these mechanical arms working, and he created the first robot that moved. He created stages that rotated all through mechanics, and this is just a sideline. And the few pageants he did, two of them, the one called Paradise, it escapes me right now, the Feast of Paradise, I forget the other one, but they're considered the two greatest pageants that were ever put on in history. And because he'd have smoke coming up from the stage, he created mist, he created, to have the moving stage and moving parts on the stage rotating, he'd have massive, in the background behind the stage, massive mechanics of arms and turbines moving, and kings and queens and the royalty would sit there in absolute amazement. They cannot believe what this guy would create. Because today it would be considered nothing, but back then it's major. Even down to the way he dressed his actors. He was very fussy. Every actor had to be, in such gallantry and beauty and his colors, and there's literally not one thing this guy did that wasn't absolutely brilliant.
No, his creative genius was basically right off the charts. You know what I mean? It's the only way to explain it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a story about one time the Pope had heard his name and he wanted some of his artwork to see, And so the Pope sent one of his guys out to ask Da Vinci. Pope wants to see some of your artwork to see. And Da Vinci apparently grabbed a piece of paper or whatever they had back then and drew a circle on it and said, "Here, give him this." And the circle was perfect. It was a perfect circle. Now, we could try probably for 100 years and we'd be able to draw a perfect circle. But that's kind of the control he had over just the hand.
The fine motor skill.
Motor skill. So obviously that was with everything with him. His brain must have been like just super hyperactive.
Yes.
So it didn't matter what it was.
Yes.
He had in all fields, and to this day there's nobody I've ever seen or heard of that can match that sort of proficiency. There are ones in certain areas, of course.
Yeah.
And there's some that are even a few areas, but with him it was just basically every single
area.
And
the damn shame is we lost a lot of his works. Like his study of anatomy, Nobody in history studied anatomy to the extent he did. And it was one of his dreams to put a book together before he died of all his 50 years of studying anatomy. Like you say, he worked with dead people. He carved them up, and he did this for years and years. At one time, he was so brilliant that they thought that no human being could be this brilliant. So they called him a sorcerer, and he must be a witch or some cockamamie thing. And so they banned him from going to the mortuary and working on things. But for most of his life, he worked on bodies and created volumes of books on biology and how the body works. And unfortunately, it never got published. It never got finished, and a lot of it was pillaged and sold off, and invading armies. Some of his descendants, distant family that got these things, sold them for peanut, for probably for very little money. But it's absolutely astounding. Now, I just want to turn our attention about Da Vinci. There's so much to talk about. We can't do it in a 30-minute podcast. People have to pick up a book and read and just see why he is the greatest mind in history. But one thing I find fascinating about him is that his greatest challenge, now he was single.
Yes.
He never got married, never had kids. He did have a couple people work with him throughout his life, these other younger artists, males, and many people believed he was gay. In fact, once he was brought to court, charged with, back then you were charged for being gay.
Yes.
For
That's
whatever
true,
they call it.
Sodomy.
Sodomy, yes.
Yeah.
And so him and 3 or 4 other people were charged with this crime. But because his father was prominent, and he was a brilliant mind, and there was another fella that was very prominent, the cousin of some king or something, on that trial, they decided to suspend his sentence, so he got off. But he did. Other than, they say, 3 or 4 years in his life, they can't account for. He went missing. They don't know what the hell was going on, whether he was actually in jail or what. But he did wander from Florence to Milan, back and forth all over the place. A lot of it because of invasions and threats and things like that. But he did spend his life single, which allowed him to focus on his work. But the one thing I find amazing about him is he couldn't finish anything. Like, with all his accomplishments, with all the great things he did, many of his commissions, especially in painting, that's why there's very few paintings that Leonardo did, only Leonardo, beginning to end. Most of them he would do it, then he'd commission other people to finish it. So you got kind of, or some people were painting paintings, they'd bring Leonardo in, can you paint an angel in this? He couldn't seem to stay with things. So many of his paintings, including Mona Lisa, he carried around with him till the day he died, because he says, well, I'm not quite finished. Now, when it comes to anatomy, same thing. He never published that book, and he brought it around, all those volumes of books, with him till the day he died. When it came to military stuff, he'd spend, a couple years developing these ingenious things, and then he'd leave it. His submarine, his diving suit, his flying machine, like he designed these things, and then he'd leave it. And this is, some say, because Da Vinci, with all his, and I want to get your opinion on this, with all his brilliance and inventiveness, he wasn't productive. Others say that because he was such a perfectionist, he was always afraid of finishing a painting, an invention, a creation, because if he finished it, there'd be room to criticize it. Have you got any thoughts about what makes a person like this?
Well, I think he just thought it could always be better. There's no such thing as perfection. I think that there's always something. Let's face it, you can always make something better.
Interesting.
And we see that today.
Yeah.
With everything, the way things are going with the technology and everything, it's just phenomenal. They'll work on things like these batteries now, these lithium batteries that are running everything. They're working on them, and every day you could go online and read about the new stuff. It's just mind-boggling how much better it gets all the time. So maybe Da Vinci realizes, being so intelligent, maybe he realized that nothing is finished. Nothing is perfect. It can always be made better.
Yes.
And he probably struggled with it, and probably like all perfectionists, he wasn't really happy with even the Mona Lisa and that. Perfectionists are never happy. They're never satisfied.
Interesting.
It can always be better. So they never stop striving. They don't look back on their laurels and think that they're... Nope, it could always be better. They could always do better.
Yes.
And that's probably why he didn't finish it. He realized it was never finished.
Never finished. His work was never finished. He never completed, and yeah, it's kind of like it's a tearjerker in a way. In a way, it's a shame that you're that brilliant. I mean, I've met people in my life, I'm sure you have too, they come up with brilliant ideas and inventions. They go, well, I'm not going to put this out because it's not quite right. I'm sure that before Zuckerberg and the other two fellas, other people came up with the idea of a Facebook as soon as the internet came out. But they go, well, this isn't quite right. But the thing is when you're an inventor and a creator, sometimes it's good, even though it's not perfect, you put it out there. Not only do you reap the rewards from it financially, but other people can now see it, study it, and build on it. Whereas he kept it in his possession. Everywhere he traveled, he carried all his books and paintings, and maybe that's part of what made him brilliant. But it's kind of a shame too.
Yeah, and the other thing about his time, nowadays we got the internet and everything, and there's millions and millions of brilliant people. Back in his time, he was basically the only. I mean, who else?
That's a good point.
Not even close. You know what I mean? Now it's just so different times and different. It is kind of a shame. But I find most of those people are like that. Most of those geniuses, they're never perfectionists. They're never really satisfied. There's always one more thing. We could tweak it this way.
Right.
We could do that, and then that bothers them.
Yeah.
Whereas we would be. I mean, if we could do 1/1,000,000th what they could do, we would be so proud and be.
Yeah.
But they're not.
No.
They're always. That's what I say about perfectionists. They're never happy. They're always trying to make it better.
Yeah.
It's never finished. It's never finished with them.
Interesting. Well, he did live a very solitude life. Like he didn't like socializing too much, although they say he was very good at it. Apparently he was strikingly beautiful as a man, very handsome, had phenomenal super physical strength. He'd bend steel bars. I mean, this guy was the picture of a Greek god, but he didn't really like socializing too much. And although he would go to pageants and feasts and things, but more to communicate with the intellectuals of society. He liked getting together with them and sharing ideas. So, yeah, kind of living in his own world for a lot of it, and always thinking of ways to make things perfect, at the same time knowing nothing can be perfect. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. You know what I mean? They're always fighting that. Perfectionist people like that. They're always fighting it, and I'm sure today the geniuses are the same. It's the same thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm sure it's the same thing. They don't. The real good ones, they don't sit back on their laurels type thing.
No.
They always want to do better.
Right.
They always, and maybe that's what makes them so phenomenal.
Right. Right. Exactly. Well, this is for our viewers. This is something that you can do. You can look at the life of Leonardo. It's endless. His inventions, ideas. We just mentioned a few here today, but there's no end to what this man created. By far the greatest mind in history. And I thank Junior for joining us today and sharing his his intuition and his comprehensive understanding of great minds. And join us again when we come back next. It looks like the next one will be Newton. Did we decide? Our next podcast we will look at the great mind of Isaac Newton. For you teachers and parents out there, if you have a son or a daughter who seems attention deficit, wandering, insatiably curious, and unable to focus on one thing or do well in school, which Da Vinci didn't even do. He didn't even go to school. He went to a trade school to become an artist. If you have a kid like that, you might have a Da Vinci on your hands and you don't know it. So this is Dr. Doctor signing off, and we're wishing you a great day and a great week.